great to have you both here today with us. Thank you very much. I'm joined by Professor Vali Nasr, Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and Dr. Lynn Kuock. You are the Lee Kuan Yew Chair in Southeast Asian Studies at the Brookings Institution. Thank you for being with us. Now, to launch our discussion, let me start with a question for both of you. How is the geopolitical realignment currently underway, viewed in Asia and, of course, in the Middle East? And Dr. Kuok, I was wondering if you could address this question to start with from the Asian perspective.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to Amundi for having me. It's great to be in the room and to be joining everyone. Lovely to meet you. I think if we talk about the most significant geopolitical development in the last couple of decades, that's really been the movement towards greater bipolarity and multipolarity. The rise of China has been dramatic. The rise of middle powers, less so. But I think both developments have been very important. Now, the rise of China has been viewed with considerable alarm in the United States and perhaps to a lesser extent in Europe. And that's quite similar in Northeast Asia, where we've seen Japan and South Korea set aside historical differences to join hands with the United States to conduct military exercises as well as other security cooperation. In Southeast Asia, however, I think the picture is rather more nuanced. Mainland Southeast Asia has traditionally had very close ties with China, and that's also the case with Vietnam, which has maritime and territorial disputes in the South China Sea with China. We are also seeing China make inroads into maritime Southeast Asia, where there are several disputes with neighbors over territorial and maritime rights. I think what was very significant this year was an annual poll conducted by the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, which found that for the first time ever, when respondents were asked about whether they would choose the United States or China if they were forced to choose, the majority of respondents this year selected China over the United States. And I think, well, the poll didn't actually prefer any reasons for this, but I think the reasons for this are twofold. First, China is regarded as having the wind behind its sails economically, and this is notwithstanding the setbacks that it's seen since COVID. And second, I think what's happening in the Middle East and developments there have considerably hardened sentiment against the United States, particularly in countries, in Muslim-majority countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, as well as Brunei. So that's sort of the sentiment vis-a-vis China. And if we look at the rise of middle powers, I think it's quite clear that this is something that's very welcome in the region. The region, like many other parts of the world, increasingly find that they feel pressured to choose between the United States and China. And the rise of middle powers offers Asia, in particular Southeast Asia, the opportunity to expand their economic as well as strategic choice. And in this respect, if we look at polls, Europe comes out top in terms of who their choice of partner is, and following somewhat behind Europe would be Japan. So.
Well, thank you very much for this great overview. I'm turning to you now, Professor Nasr, for your perspective from the Middle East.
So for the Middle East, the global realignment really started during the President Obama's pivot to Asia moment. So the Middle East understood essentially the global realignment to mean that the United States was going to recalibrate its presence in the Middle East, focus on Asia, and potentially focus on Europe. And that obviously posed a lot of security challenges for many countries in the Middle East who had been very dependent on the United States. Now we're in a different phase. It looks like the United States is coming back to the Middle East because of the Gaza war, but the implications of what's happening is far broader than what we're seeing. The United States is now being seen essentially as incapable of managing the Middle East. It's incapable of getting a ceasefire. It's incapable of having any kind of an influence on its principal ally in the region, Israel. It's incapable of giving assurances to the Arabs. And as a result, we're in a phase where Middle East populations are becoming very anti-American, as similar to Muslim majority countries in Asia. But the governments in the Middle East are also now pivoting away from the United States. It used to be that the United States was pivoting away from the Middle East. Now the Middle Eastern countries are pivoting away from the United States. And in that sense, they are looking to China in particular to play a very different role. So when Saudi Arabia wants to bury the hatchet with Iran, wants to have stability in the Gulf, it does not believe that the United States is actually the superpower that will bring stability to the Gulf. The United States seen as escalating with Iran into a war, whereas China is seen as to have the diplomatic capability and the interest to actually bridge things between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then the war in Ukraine has also, unbeknownst to most of the world, has created a north-south corridor for Russia that runs through Iran into UAE, into the Gulf, and the Russians and the Chinese are looking at this corridor essentially as a long-term access that is going to connect the Middle East to Asia. One of the biggest issues for the United States now dealing with Saudi Arabia and UAE is not Iran anymore. It's curtailing Chinese and Russian economic influence in the Gulf. And so essentially the Middle East is interested in security umbrella of the United States when and if it can have it, but it does not want to be a total client of the United States to the exclusion of China and Russia. So the United States has been sort of strategically diminished in the Middle East, not because it's leaving, but because the region is actually turning away from the United States.
It's a complex picture, indeed, but I'd like you to spend maybe more time talking about your expectations or what we can foresee for the three main conflict theaters currently in the Middle East. You mentioned Gaza, of course, Lebanon, and Israel, Iran. How do you expect it to unfold?
Well, we're in a very critical moment in the sense that there are too many issues that are up in the air, and the picture has changed completely. If you looked at Israel, its notion of security and deterrence that it enjoyed before October 6th is gone, and the war has not restored it. It does not, neither the sense of security to Israeli population nor the sense of deterrence vis-a-vis the region. The Arab countries who were looking to be building corridors, trade corridors, invest in these grandiose visions for the future and normalize with Israel, basically have to go back to the drawing board. And the winners in the region seem to be that axis of resistance, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and these groups which are sort of ascendant. And we don't have a stability essentially emerging in this, and the United States, as I mentioned, is incapable of providing it. So we are looking at whether or not we can have a ceasefire in Gaza tomorrow, but in reality is that the Middle East is entering into a period of instability and potential conflict, first in Gaza itself for a foreseeable future, and then along the border with Lebanon, between Israel and Lebanon, and potentially between the two great powers in this region, which is now Iran and Israel, effectively, militarily speaking, which are arrayed against one another. And so we are continuously at the edge of war, and the United States is scrambling sort of to just avoid it, just in time.
Asia is, of course, not immune to regional tension, especially in the South China Sea. So can you tell us more about the impact on regional stability you expect from the dynamic relationship between China and Taiwan and the risk of escalation in the South China Sea?
Thank you very much. I think it's quite clear, quite evident that both Taiwan as well as the South China Sea are two flashpoints in the region, and I think it's heating up there as well. If we look at the issue of Taiwan, senior US military officials have projected a possible invasion by 2027 or even as early as 2025. However, when I have asked about, press further about the rationale for that and how they came to that assessment, I think what is clear is that this was less a statement of actual intent than a statement of potential capacity. In other words, the US military officials project that China might have the capacity to invade Taiwan by 2027 or 2025. So in my view, I think that the risk of a short-term escalation over the Taiwan Strait, that's probably a little bit overblown. Nonetheless, I think the risk in the medium to longer term is real, particularly as China's capacity to prevail in a war over Taiwan dovetails with what it sees as a casus belli to go to wars, right? So I think a critical question in my mind is what China considers to be the red line for invasion of Taiwan and whether its red line is actually expanding. So I think what's quite clear is that China perceives any declaration of Taiwan of independence to be a clear red line. But its 2005 Anti-Succession Act actually sets out two other instances when China might invade Taiwan. The wording of this provision is very unclear, but we've heard Chinese officials increasingly talk about the risk of foreign interference. And I think what I would be watching for is, how many more statements they make about foreign interference and how vociferous these objections are, because, the red line might be shifting. Now, in the South China Sea, I think I see two potential pathways to war. One is an incident at sea or air between the United States and China, and we saw a similar incident in 2001 in the EP3 incident when a US surveillance aircraft collided with a Chinese fighter jet in the South China Sea, just off the Chinese island of Hainan. And in this case, conflict was contained, but that was a very different situation. Now we have heightened tensions between the United States and China, an increasingly militarily capable China, as well as social media, which can only pour oil on fire. So it's a lot more dangerous now. And the second pathway to war in the South China Sea is where a US ally, the Philippines, might potentially drag the US into a war. So we've seen recent skirmishes between China and the Philippines over Second Thomas Shoal. China has prevented Philippines resupply missions to a very old naval vessel that the Philippines grounded in 1999 to protect its claims there. And these have been relatively minor. I think it's gone relatively unnoticed, apart from mainly in the region. But this could well trigger the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and China, which is triggered in the event of an armed conflict against public vessels, aircraft, or the armed forces. So I think these are potential pathways to war, but I think while we focus on the points of escalation, we must not forget that even short of war, we should be worried about the deteriorating situation. So the rule of law is being eroded in the region and beyond, and I think that speaks poorly to our ability to keep conflict in check. So competition is okay, even conflict is okay, but we don't want conflict breaking out into kinetic war, and I think the rule of law and maintaining that is critical for ensuring that that does not happen.
So clearly the US-China relationship is critical here. Dr. Nasr, given what's been said about it, how do you expect ties between Iran, Russia, North Korea and China to evolve? And do you see different scenarios under a Biden versus a Trump administration?
First of all, I don't see a major difference. And I think in the Middle East, most people think there is not going to be any difference between Biden and Trump. The capabilities of the United States to manage the Middle East are not going to be different. Trump was as much averse to war and conflict in the Middle East as Biden is. And I would say, just having returned from the Middle East, everybody's already calculating that Trump is going to be president. So it's not even a question for them. They may be wrong, but it's a fact on the ground. Now, the relationship between Russia, China, and Iran in particular is driven by US sanctions, not by policy. I mean, this is one aspect of the global economy of US policy that is extremely important. I remember a while back somebody told me in Asia that even in China people think everybody's future is Iran. As once you appear on the US's sanctions pathway, sanctions are not reversible, they never go back. Once you're on it, they're just going to increase, and you're going to go down that path. And these countries are developing a common interest in creating a Eurasian landmass that would exclude the United States from it, that would enable them to trade. They are investing in the Gulf, and other areas of the world, including Turkey, in creating outlets to the outside world. They are sharing technologies about sanctions circumvention, about going around SWIFT. They're talking and investing in ways in which to go around the dollar. And these are long-term investments. And China obviously is the bigger piece in here. But what is happening right now between Russia and Iran and the Gulf is indicative of sort of alternate economic markets, alternative economic mechanism, alternate supply chains, financial networks emerging. And this is pushing these countries together. Unless the United States sanctions strategy changes, unless it actually shows capability to lift sanctions, these countries basically see their futures together. It's not that they like each other. It's that they're just basically facing the same enemy in US economic sanctions, and look to one another in order to deal with it. And this actually, I would just say, that puts some countries in the region, at least I work on, like Saudi Arabia, UAE, India, and even Turkey, in a very difficult position, because they are dealing with China and Russia, and all of them are always one step away from being caught in secondary sanctions. And for many outside businesses that do business in the Middle East, this is an important issue to take note of.
We're almost out of time, sadly, because this is a really fascinating and very helpful conversation indeed. I'm going to ask you both a very similar question. You've mentioned previously, you alluded to the rather favorable position Europe is in currently in Asia in terms of positioning and image. So I'd like to know how, from your perspective, Europe can enhance its foreign policy and leverage the current geopolitical landscape to strengthen its influence and leadership in Asia.
Thanks for that. So, I mean, from what I mentioned earlier, the poll that I mentioned puts Europe in strong stead to enhance its influence in Asia. I think there are two main approaches that Europe should consider. And that is first, it should take a strong stance to defend and promote the rule of law, even if it might increase tensions in the short term, as we see in the case of the naval presence from Europe in the South China Sea. Europe has a comparative advantage in economics, and so it certainly should be thinking about how it can use its economic tools and levers to for greater strategic ends. But I think what is clear is that it cannot be business as usual, and just trading and operating as it did in the last couple of decades is not going to ensure that the sea routes remain open and ensure that there is no deterioration of the rule of law in Asia, which then impacts the broader global environment. I think most European governments have understood that, and in the last few years we've seen various Indo-Pacific strategies emerging from governments like France, Germany, the Netherlands, and even the EU. So I think most of Europe has already understood that there is a connection between developments in Asia as well as developments back home, and have been acting on that basis. So I'm quite encouraged in that respect. The second point I would make is that, I think Europe, while defending the rule of law staunchly, should also take steps to ensure that anti-China sentiment and an anti-China bloc isn't unnecessarily heightened, because I think that is counterproductive. Certainly, the region is worried about China's unlawful and coercive activities. However, it does not see China per se as a threat, and it certainly does not see its difficulties with China in the South China Sea, for instance, as the sum total of its relationship. So I think insofar as Europe is able to stride, in a sense, on the one hand, strongly defending the rule of law, even if it might raise tensions in the short term, and on the other hand, ensuring that it is a moderating force on some of the more anti-China strains coming out of the United States, I think it stands itself in good stead. The question, of course, is whether or not Europe, with a war in its neighborhood and a crisis in the Middle East, has the will as well as the capacity to do so. But I think its future, its economic and security future does depend on developments in Asia as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kuok. We have just a minute to wrap up. Sure. Sorry about that. Your perspective.
So the picture is exactly the opposite in Asia. Europe, and particularly Germany and Britain, have lost a lot of altitude in the Middle East. They've lost pretty much all of their soft power. And this is going to be long-term, and the consequences of it is going to be broad-based. But very simply put, many in the United States, in Europe, think that the Middle East is only 3 rich Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar. And that's what the Middle East is. And true, sale of energy and the amount of money that those sovereign wealth funds have and the money they spend is still there, and there's plenty of money to be made. But it's important to note that those countries are not suspended in midair. They're sitting in the middle of 250 million angry Arabs. And their economic visions for Vision 2030, Vision 2050, all of these things, all these corridors they want to build is only viable if the rest of the Arab world is inclined towards the United States, is inclined towards Europe, and is stable. And what really worries even those Gulf countries is that Europe and the United States are completely oblivious to this simple fact. And they're playing with fire in terms of liquidating their positions in the region, which puts all the burden on these governments to sustain the relationship with Europe and the US. And they particularly think the Europeans are doing nothing in the Middle East in order to make relationships with Europe easy for these countries.
Well, thank you very much. We promised you very rich and insightful discussions. I think you will prove, indeed, that they're happening here today. Many thanks to you. We've run out of time. Yes, please. I guess deserve a round of applause. Just wanted to flag the fact that we're now going to be joined by Amundi's experts to consider how all this will affect investors. Many thanks to our guests, of course, Dr. Nasr and Dr. Kuok, and Professor Nasr. Thank you so much.